Hi, I'm Vimla Rapidu and I'm the Head of Experience at Culture Shift, and I'm here today to talk about how to become a leader in HR data. Culture Shift is an organisation that is building software to help people who have experienced bullying or harassment in the workplace or higher education report the incident and get the support that they need. We use an evidence-based approach to make sure that survivors get the help that they need through a survivor-centric support system. We're trying to create meaningful and sustainable change in organisations to have greater impact for the people that work there and to improve the employee experience. We do this through a four-step process of activating, listening, supporting and analysing. We activate people and empower them to report the incident. We listen to what's happened, we give them their support, and we analyse the data to prevent the same incidents from happening again and understand the trends that are happening. But what we know so far is HR has a data problem. We collect data across the board, but we don't analyse it and we don't see the trends. And what happens is we end up in a situation where someone like Trump is sitting in a room full of white men making a decision about abortion, taking into consideration the lives of women without women in the room. And the reason why this is so intrinsically linked to HR and data is because the systems that we have in place, the systemic and institutionalised biases that we've inbuilt into our systems, perpetuate a problem that enable people to get into positions of power. So this image could look like your boardroom or the exec room or the decision-making room. This could be any organisation around the world, and it's an image that we see time and time again, because we're not using the data that we have at our disposal to help us make decisions. Our unconscious bias gets in the way. All of our processes and procedures are steeped in unconscious bias, and that isn't a bad thing. The problem is when we don't recognise our unconscious bias. Everyone has bias. Our biases are made up of every experience that we've had, the cultures that we live in, and our brains are hardwired to have these biases to help us survive. But what we have to do is recognise them and understand that the way that they're infringing on our decision-making powers and the ability that we have to change things for people around us. Because we end up in situations where BAME people are being overqualified and underpaid for the positions that they're in. Our BAME colleagues are there in the room with more degrees, better education, but are being paid lower than their white counterparts. We put in processes in place that prevent transparency of pay in the workplace, so these conversations aren't even being had or the messages aren't being addressed. It's not until someone goes in and does a report or runs through the system that we can start to see what's happening. And we're all used to gender pay gap reporting. We're told how important it is to have gender equality in the workplace, but that hasn't manifested itself for everything else that makes us different. We don't hold our other differences in the same esteem as we do as gender at the moment. And we need to change that through data, through understanding how we can use data to make those decisions. And it's true again when we look at the recruitment process and how we sift through applications. What this article shows is when white colleagues send in an application form with the same level of education and same level of experience as their BAME colleagues, white people are more likely to get a job or get the interview. And I can talk to this through first-hand experience. My sister took her name off her CV recently to see if it would make a difference to her getting into job interviews, and it did. She tried time and time again with over 15 years experience in her sector to apply for jobs with her name on it, and she was getting nowhere. She wasn't getting any emails back, she wasn't getting the interview. As soon as she took her name off her CV, she was getting called back left, right and centre. So this isn't just a statistic, this isn't just an experience or a news headline that is over-exaggerated or based on fallacy. This is true. This is the lived experience of people every day in 2020, let alone the historic years that we've seen. And I guarantee you'll walk into any department, any organisation, and they will say their recruitment process is fair and equal. And this is the importance of recognising our unconscious bias, because whether we like it or not, we recruit people who we're comfortable with. We recruit people who look like us. And that makes it 10 times harder for anyone who's different to get through the door. And the statistics break this down into those different races as well. And you can see the disparity that we place on people from different backgrounds, whether it's Pakistani or South American or Caribbean. It's different for everyone. And that's actually why terms like BAME are problematic, because what we do is group BAME people, Black and minority ethnic people, into one category, where actually everyone who makes up that category is different, has a really different lived experience, and we need to take that into our consideration when we're doing our kind of analytics and data analysis. What I really want you to do, and what I really want you to take away from this talk, is go back into your organisations and sing the mantra that it's time to get comfortable being uncomfortable. Because we need to step out of our comfort zones, recognise our bias, and take on these problems head on. It means accepting that we will have been the recipient of privileges that we don't even recognise, and that the opportunities we've had to get into our positions aren't equal for everyone. But with that opportunity and with that privilege, we have a power to make a difference for the people around us. We can open up doors that had previously been shut. Because what we have seen at the moment is a huge rise in social movements, like the Black Lives Matter movement, where people have literally taken to the streets in protest around these systemic problems. And this isn't true of just race, this is true of the trans movement, which is happening at the moment. It's true of gender identity, sexuality. The world is in flux, and it's time for us as leaders to start using the tools we have at our disposal to make real, tangible change. Because what we've seen is it isn't changing. As we start to grow our recruitment processes, our HR processes, and the tools that we start to use, those tools are being built with bias in them. The technology that we're using to help us do our jobs, the computers that we're using, the software that we're buying, has inbuilt bias into the algorithms and AI that are helping us make decisions. Newer recruitment technology, it has been infected with bias, not just because it's based on historical data that proliferate the problem itself, but because the developers who are building it with their bias in mind. So that recruitment issue we talked about before of sifting through people with more European names versus BAME names is only going to get worse if we rely on algorithms to show us that that's who's better for the job, because that's what the data shows us. We need to step in and say that data isn't good enough, and we need to start collecting it again. We need to step in and understand how we can use data to help show us the problem, not show us the answer. So how has this happened? How have we ended up in this? We know that there's unconscious bias in the system, but what's made it worse? One way that this has happened is the structure of traditional organisations. So traditionally, you'll have your HR team who sits in one part of the organisation, you'll have your line managers that sit in another, you'll have your senior leadership, your exec board decision makers who sit in another part. You'll then have your operations, you'll have your development team, you'll have your staff on the ground, your customer services, all operating in silos across the organisation. As that organisation grows, those silos become even more closer knit and the walls start to get built around them. And it becomes harder for those silos to talk to one another. So your HR will continue to operate in its HR capacity and will talk to its other silos as and when it needs to, but not on a day-to-day basis. And the same will happen for your leadership team. They'll be making decisions, understanding, maybe getting data from each point, but working in isolation. The same will happen for your line managers, the same will happen for every part of the organisation. And what you start to see happening is disparate, disconnected decisions being made across the board that have an impact on the future of the organisation without a clear direction of travel, but probably all operating towards the same values. And then, to make it worse, we start to see lots of different systems and processes in play that can end up looking like a cockpit in a plane. You've got all of these levers to pull, you've got all of these pieces of technology and software that you're using to track and manage different things. So your HR team will be using a recruitment portal, or it will be tracking information through a system to understand holidays and who's taking time off and when, and who's been sick, and probably some of those protected characteristics. Then you might use a different bit of software to send out a employee survey to understand satisfaction and happiness and to do a pulse check of the organisation. But then actually your line managers might be doing that on a weekly basis and using a completely different system to understand how their reports are doing and what's going on the ground. Then your exec board might be measuring KPIs in a completely different way. And slowly but surely what you start to see is lots of different tools being used across an organisation that aren't talking to one another. And no one's trying to pull all of those bits of data together to understand the picture of the organisation as a whole. So what we do is we collect lots of data. We collect data from lots of systems, and it just exists. It exists in the plethora of that organisation and probably doesn't get looked at. Or it takes so long to analyse that by the time you've written the report or done the recommendations or have the statistics, it's outdated because half the team have already left. And I'm sure we've seen these forms before, the ones that collect protected characteristics. We collect this data usually when people are joining an organisation, but do we check it again when they've left? Or we give this information over to services and systems left, right and centre, but how important is it for the places that we work? And yes, we collect all of this data, but the crux is what we do with it. Data is only as important as the decisions we make off the back of it. It's only as powerful as the way that we analyse it and the way that we share that with the people who can make decisions. And so we all know we care about things like staff turnover, how many people are in the organisation, how many people are leaving, because that can be a really good indication of culture or happiness or changes that need to be made. We know we care about engagement because engagement is a success metrics for a good company to work with. If your staff are more engaged, it tends to mean they're happier, it tends to mean they're doing their job well, it tends to mean that they're satisfied with the way things are going. So we care about engagement. We also care about happiness. We know that happier staff do a better job, they're more likely to stay, they're more likely to recommend people, they're more likely to promote the organisation outside and be ambassadors. And we also care about bullying. We want to know if people are being discriminated against. We want to know if people are leaving because of a bully. We want to address those issues. But how comfortable are people really to talk about this in the workplace? And we know we care about promotions. We want to know who's getting promoted in the organisation and why. We want to see how those promotions look. We want to help people stay in the company and climb up that career ladder because staff turnover is expensive. But what if we flipped the model? What if we added some intersectionality into this? And what if we cared about engagement by gender? What if non-binary people were less engaged than their male colleagues? What would that tell us about the working environment that they're in? Or what if we cared about happiness by age? What if older people were more happy in the organisation than young people? What if we actually see a middle-aged person being way happier in the organisation than anyone else? What does that tell us about our organisation, the culture that we're building? What does it tell us about the people we're recruiting? What if there aren't any older people in this organisation at all? What if we looked at bullying by ability? Would that show us anything? Are we discriminating against different ability bodies in ways that we hadn't anticipated? Are we cross-examining our data to show us that? Are we showing that intersectionality at all? And what if we looked at promotions by education? Are we giving more promotions to people with a better education than, say, if they didn't have a university degree or had a different educational route? Is our unconscious bias leading us to promote people with a better education or a university degree to higher positions? And what does that say about the unconscious bias that we're building into our processes? So what we really need to do is start analysing our data, because it's up to us as leaders in the space to use the tools that we already have, the massive amounts of data that exist in all of those systems and processes, and putting it together to tell us the story and reflect back on what's happening in the organisation, so that we can start making decisions on what to do next, how to prevent those problems, to start showing us what's happening. Because Culture Shift produced a report that showed us some of the data that exists in organisations. And 46% of people said that when it comes to diversity, their workplace wasn't doing good enough. And when we applied an intersectional lens on this, we saw that 58% of BAME people said that more needed to be done. And so what this shows us, if we had only looked through one lens at that data, we would have seen, yes, it's a problem. When we scratched the surface, we saw it was much more of a problem for BAME colleagues, and therefore more needs to be done in those organisations. And it can look even more bleak. When we looked at the conditions for working from home and people's reception to that through COVID, we saw that 48% of employees, BAME employees, were more comfortable working from home than 35% of their white colleagues. And what this tells us is that working environments aren't set up for people with different backgrounds. There is a problem with working environments for people from BAME backgrounds, and we need to do something about it. And we wouldn't know this exists if we weren't looking at the data and we weren't analysing it to see that intersectionality. And so we can't solve a problem if we don't know it exists. If we don't look at the data and applying the intersectionality and examining it through these different lenses, we won't know the problem exists and we won't be able to do anything about it. We'll continue to make the same mistakes again and again, and nothing will change. And most importantly, this is all data that you already have. This data exists in your different tools and processes across your organisation. It's just up to you now to put it together and to help tell the story that needs to be heard. And if you don't have this data already, the time is now to start collecting it so you can hold a mirror up to your organisation and see what's happening on the ground and see the reality and lived experience for people that are different to you. Because what we know, what the statistics show us, is that this kind of data and the decisions that we can make can see a decrease in absenteeism, better productivity, and better business overall. It leads to better return on investment, better innovation, and more creativity in your organisation, which leads to happier, more satisfied people. Because the world is changing, and we need to be a part of that change. The time is now to make the decisions that matter, to help us design a future that we're all happy to work in. And it is up to us to see what the data tells us and to make the decisions that matter. Thank you.